was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Dawn marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're gonna go to college, you're gonna have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point, and tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's gonna be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right? And she says, oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia and anorexia.
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She said, Sean, you came to see me. And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well-known, the family's well-known. She has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day, we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy, but there was always something. about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. And I held on to it until I felt the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. I had people in my hometown that were there. I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning, and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior, and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well until one day he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened. I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, "Look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never has." He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, "Okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold?" I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, "We got your blood results." Wendy was pregnant.
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC medical center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be evil.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife Wendy has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. And I just looked at her, and I was like, will you shut the up? Or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed, and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did in fact have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, on the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before, and then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous base. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head, she even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. I had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16th, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13th, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She'd been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90-plus degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. Yeah, I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time, and we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan, and so I attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person. But I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
You have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, tell me what you did to your daughter.
Ms. Scott, could you tell us please what you did to...
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement. She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life. And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed. And as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then was appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man. but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
The phone rings at 2:17 a.m., not the kind of call that brings clarity, not the kind that ever brings sleep back once it's answered, a low buzz cutting through the stale quiet of a precinct that smells like old paper and cold coffee. And on the other end, a voice hesitates, breath uneven, words tripping over each other, says a name that hasn't been spoken out loud in years, says a street that no longer looks the same, says I was there, I saw it happen, and then falls silent as if the weight of the sentence has crushed the air out of the room, and in that instant a New York 2001 cold case exhales, dust lifting from forgotten folders, fluorescent lights flickering back on over a crime everyone stopped believing would ever speak again. Back then the city was raw, sirens still echoing differently after September, eyes always lifting to the skyline, nerves stretched thin, and in a narrow stretch of Upper Manhattan a young woman vanished between one block and the next. The kind of disappearance that doesn't explode, doesn't scream, just slips into the cracks of a city too busy to notice one missing face until it's already too late, until posters start appearing on lampposts and deli windows. Her smile photocopied and fading in. The rain, last seen here, please call this number, and neighbors shake their heads saying she was careful, she always called, she wouldn't just leave. Her apartment was small, second floor walk-up, the kind where every sound bleeds through the walls, but that night no one reported a scream, no crash, no struggle, just an unanswered phone and a door locked from the outside, bed made, shoes gone. A cup in the sink with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. Ordinary details that investigators learn to fear because ordinary means nothing to grab onto, nothing that bleeds or breaks or shouts motive, just absence, just space where a person should be. The first officers on scene walked slow, eyes trained to notice what the mind wants to dismiss, the way the window latch was loose but not forced, the faint scuff near the doorframe that could be nothing, the smell of cleaning solution too sharp for a place that small. And already the questions began stacking. Did she leave willingly? Did someone she knew knock on that door? Did the city swallow her whole without leaving teeth marks? And outside the building traffic rolled on, horns blaring. Music thumping from passing cars, New York refusing to pause even for its missing. By dawn the story hit the wires, missing woman, early 20s, last seen Tuesday evening, police request assistance, and the phones rang with tips that led nowhere. A woman who looked like her on the subway, someone matching her description near the river. A cab driver who wasn't sure but wanted to help, and each lead burned time and energy until it fizzled, until detectives returned to the same empty apartment and stared at the same walls, hoping they'd missed something the first time. Friends described her routines in meticulous detail. The coffee shop she favored, the shortcuts she took home, the way she avoided certain streets at night, and detectives traced those paths again and again, shoes pounding pavement, eyes scanning doorways, trash bags, alley shadows, and still nothing surfaced, no body, no weapon, no witness who could say I saw her get into a car or I heard her arguing, just a city-sized silence that grew heavier with every passing day. Weeks turned to months, months to years. The file thickened, but the answers did not, and the case slid into that purgatory investigators hate, not officially closed, but no longer burning hot, reassigned desks, new crimes demanding attention. The missing woman's name whispered less often, her parents aging in waiting rooms, hope thinning like paper rubbed too many times between anxious fingers, and eventually someone stamped the words cold case across the cover, not because anyone believed it, was solved, but because time had won another round. Cold cases don't die. They calcify, layers of speculation hardening around a core of facts that never change, and this one collected theories like dust, a secret boyfriend, a random predator, a neighbor with a temper, an accident covered up in panic. And each theory had its champions and its dead ends, each left behind notes and arrows and circled names that meant nothing without proof, and every few years someone would take it off the shelf, flip through the pages, feel that familiar frustration, and put it back. Then, years later, the call comes, late-night confession shocks police, the words lighting up internal emails, drawing veterans back to their desks, pulling rookies into whispered conversations, because confessions at 2 a.m. are never simple. They're either lies desperate for attention or truths that have rotted long enough to start leaking, and this voice on the line didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't brag, didn't cry, just said, "I need to tell you what happened. I can't sleep anymore." Detectives listened, pens hovering, recording devices humming softly, as the caller described a night from 2 decades earlier with unsettling clarity. The weather, the sound of a radio somewhere, the smell of garbage piled high on the curb. Details that aren't in news articles, details that don't come from Google searches, and with each sentence the room grew quieter, the sense creeping in that this might be something different, something dangerous, something that could crack open a story long sealed. He talked about being nearby, about seeing her, about following without realizing it at first, about a moment that spiraled, words tumbling faster now, and when he stopped to breathe, an officer leaned forward and asked a question no one wanted to ask too soon. "Where is she now?" And the line went silent again, seconds stretching, the kind of silence that makes hearts thump in ears, and when he answered it wasn't with a location, it was with uncertainty, with memory blurred by years of denial, with phrases like "I think" and "maybe" and "I'm not sure anymore." That's how hope enters a cold case, not with certainty but with a crack, and investigators moved carefully, aware of how easily that crack can widen into disappointment, cross-checking his statements against old reports, finding unsettling overlaps, streets that matched, timelines that fit too neatly to ignore, and still there were gaps, pieces missing that refused to slide into place, and the confession, shocking as it was, didn't deliver the one thing everyone wanted, a body, a definitive end. News of the call leaked within days, headlines splashing across screens. New York 2001 cold case reopened, late-night confession shocks police, the public devouring every word, speculating, arguing, pointing fingers anew, and the family, long trained to brace for false hope, felt that old ache bloom again, the terrible mix of relief and dread that comes with movement after years of stillness, because movement means possibility, and possibility means pain if it stops again. Investigators retrace the city with fresh eyes, guided now by a voice from the past, walking routes long erased by construction and time, standing where buildings once stood, trying to overlay memory onto a landscape that refused to cooperate. And each step felt like chasing a ghost through a crowd, close enough to sense, impossible to grasp, and still they pushed, driven by the knowledge that cases like this don't reopen often, and when they do, it's usually because something is about to change. But as the days passed, questions multiplied instead of shrinking. The caller recanted parts, amended others, fear creeping into his tone as the reality of consequences loomed, and doubt began to seep back into the room. Because confessions without evidence are fragile things, and fragile things shatter under pressure, and somewhere in the maze of Manhattan streets the truth waited, silent, unmoved by headlines or late-night calls, leaving a community once again suspended between answers and shadows, the cold case breathing just enough to remind everyone that it was never really gone. By the second morning after the call, the precinct feels different, like a room where someone has whispered a secret too dangerous to ignore, desks cluttered with reopened files, yellowed photographs spread out again under harsh fluorescent light, faces frozen in time staring back at detectives who have aged 2 decades since those pictures were first printed, and the name on the folder, once pushed to the back of the cabinet, now sitting front and center, heavy with expectation and dread. Because reopening a cold case doesn't just mean chasing a lead, it means reopening every mistake, every missed chance, every night someone went home wondering if they'd failed a stranger they'd never forget. The confession keeps replaying in everyone's head, the cadence of the caller's voice, the way certain details slipped out effortlessly while others came wrapped in hesitation, and detectives know this pattern too well. Memory sharpened around moments of fear, dulled everywhere else, trauma carving grooves in the mind that time can't fully smooth, and still there were fragments that wouldn't let go. The mention of a delivery truck idling too long, the flicker of a broken streetlight, the sound of footsteps echoing in a stairwell that no longer exists, and those fragments are enough to justify moving forward, enough to send teams back out into the city. They start with what can still be touched, old evidence boxes cracked open, gloves snapping tight around wrists, the faint smell of dust and cardboard rising as if the past itself is being disturbed, items catalogued again with modern eyes. Fibers once dismissed now photographed under stronger lenses, a hair sealed in plastic re-examined with technology that didn't exist when it was first collected, and every test feels like rolling dice against time, because DNA degrades, labels fade. And not everything survives 20 years of waiting. At the same time, detectives sit down with people who thought they were done talking, former neighbors, old coworkers, friends who moved on and built lives far away from that year, that street, that name, and reopening those conversations is like pulling at scar tissue. Questions reopening wounds they learned to live with. Did you notice anything strange, anyone hanging around, any arguments, any secrets she might have kept? And the answers come haltingly, filtered through memory and guilt. Because everyone wonders if they missed something obvious, something that could have changed everything. One former neighbor remembers a noise now, not a scream but a thump, late, maybe midnight, something they'd brushed off as furniture moving, something that felt too small to report even then, and another recalls a man in the hallway they didn't recognize. Standing too still, eyes fixed on the elevator numbers, details that sound insignificant alone but begin to vibrate when stacked together, because cold cases thrive on the accumulation of maybes, the thin line between coincidence and pattern. The caller, meanwhile, becomes both asset and liability, his statements scrutinized word by word, his timeline compared against cell phone records that barely exist, pay stubs, transit passes, anything that can anchor his story to something real. And detectives notice how his certainty spikes around certain moments and collapses around others, how he insists he never meant for it to go that far, a phrase that sets off alarms in every trained mind in the room, because accidents don't usually require 20 years of silence to confess. Pressure mounts as media interest explodes, vans parking outside the precinct, cameras hungry for updates, reporters repeating the phrase late-night confession until it loses its meaning, and internally there's a push and pull. The need to move fast colliding with the risk of moving wrong, because if this confession unravels publicly it won't just damage the case, it will harden it forever, sealing it back into the cold with a layer of cynicism thicker than before. Investigators return to the route she took that night, reconstructing her movements step by step, timing traffic lights, listening to the rhythm of the neighborhood after dark, and they realize how much the city has changed, how entire blocks have been erased, how what was once a shadowed stretch is now bright and busy, and that contrast makes the past feel both distant and uncomfortably close, because violence doesn't need dark corners, it just needs opportunity. They focus on a narrow window, the 15 minutes between her last confirmed sighting and the moment her phone went silent, a slice of time small enough to seem manageable, enormous enough to hide anything, and within that window they place the caller, placing him near enough to matter, far enough to deny intent, and they start testing his story by breaking it apart, asking him to recount it backward, sideways, focusing on sensory details, watching where his eyes go when he speaks, listening for the shifts in tone that betray rehearsed lines. He grows more agitated as the days pass, the weight of attention pressing down, and in one interview he admits to something new, not a location, not a body, but a name, someone else who is there, someone he says panicked, someone who told him to keep quiet. And suddenly the case fractures again, branching into possibilities that double the work and triple the risk, because now there's another ghost to chase, another life potentially implicated by a story that may or may not be true. Detectives dig into that name, finding a man who fits just well enough to worry them, someone who lived nearby, someone with a temper on record, someone who left the city shortly after the disappearance. But records are thin, memories thinner. And the trail feels like chasing smoke, every lead dissolving just as it starts to feel solid, and frustration creeps back in, familiar and corrosive, the sense that the case is resisting resolution the way it always has. Meanwhile, the family watches from the sidelines, learning details through headlines instead of phone calls, their pain repackaged for public consumption, and they oscillate between hope and anger, grateful that someone is finally talking, terrified that it will lead nowhere. Because for them the cold case never went cold, it just went quiet, a constant hum beneath every holiday, every birthday, every empty chair at the table. Inside the precinct, tempers flare, arguments breaking out over strategy, some insisting the confession is the key, others warning it's a distraction, a confession shaped by guilt and media narratives rather than truth. And those arguments echo late into the night, fueled by stale coffee and the knowledge that time is not on their side, because witnesses age, suspects disappear, and the city keeps moving, indifferent to the urgency inside these walls. A break seems to come unexpectedly, not from the confession but from an old evidence log, a note scribbled in the margin about a trash pickup delayed that night, a small bureaucratic detail that leads investigators to rethink disposal routes, dump sites, places where something could have been hidden briefly before being moved again, and it sends them back into the field with maps and measuring wheels, tracing the arteries of a city that hides its secrets in plain sight. They search where they can, dig where they're allowed, guided by probabilities rather than certainty, and each shovelful of dirt feels like a gamble, because finding nothing is almost worse than finding something terrible. Nothing means questions survive another day. Nothing means the cold case keeps breathing, just enough to haunt everyone involved, and as the sun sets on another long shift, the detectives understand a brutal truth. Reopening this case has changed everything and solved nothing. And somewhere between the confession that shook them and the silence that followed, the line between progress and illusion has blurred, leaving them standing once again at the edge of a mystery that refuses to reveal whether it's finally ready to break or simply playing its oldest trick, pulling them deeper before disappearing all over again. The third week after the confession begins with rain hammering the city hard enough to blur the edges of everything, streets shining like black glass, and inside the precinct the mood turns heavier, quieter, as if everyone senses they are stepping into deeper water. Because the initial adrenaline has burned off and what remains is the slow, grinding work where cases either yield or collapse under their own contradictions. The caller has lawyered up now, his voice filtered through counsel, his willingness to talk suddenly measured and cautious, and detectives feel the window narrowing, the space where truth might slip out shrinking by the hour. They replay the recordings again, listening not just to what he says, but to what he avoids, the way his sentences curve around certain moments like a driver swerving to miss something in the road, and one phrase keeps resurfacing. Something he muttered near the end of the first call, barely audible beneath his own breathing, about the river, about thinking it would all disappear there, and that fragment becomes an obsession, a wordless pull that draws attention south, east, anywhere water moves. And hides. But rivers in New York are not quiet, not forgiving. They are documented, dredged, monitored, and detectives know how often desperate stories lean on water because it feels final, because it feels like erasure, and still they cannot ignore it. So they go back to old maps, old tide charts, old reports of debris and unidentified remains pulled from currents years ago, matching dates, matching descriptions, hoping for an overlap that will turn speculation into fact. At the same time, pressure builds from above, commanders asking for timelines, for progress, for something concrete to justify the resources now pouring into a case some quietly wish had stayed buried, and detectives respond with cautious optimism. The language of maybes and potential leads, because the truth is they are balancing on a knife edge, one misstep away from public embarrassment, one lucky break away from resolution, and they don't know which way the blade will tilt. The second name introduced by the caller becomes a fixation, a shadow presence that complicates everything, and digging into his past reveals a trail that's messy enough to be dangerous, minor charges, heated disputes. A reputation that makes people lower their voices when asked about him, but nothing that ties him definitively to the night in question. And when detectives finally locate him, older now, heavier, eyes guarded, he reacts with a mix of indignation and fear that reads as both genuine and performative, denying involvement while simultaneously offering too many details about why he couldn't possibly be involved. Interviews stretch on, questions looping back, inconsistencies flagged and circled, and detectives notice how the two stories don't quite align, how timelines overlap just enough to suggest proximity but not collaboration, how each man seems eager to shift weight onto the other without fully committing to a shared narrative, and this is where cold cases often die, in the space between competing half-truths that cancel each other out. Meanwhile, forensic teams deliver results that land with a dull thud instead of a bang, partial profiles, inconclusive matches, data that narrows possibilities without naming anyone, and the disappointment is palpable. The sense that technology can only do so much when time has chewed away at the evidence, and detectives remind themselves that progress isn't always loud, that sometimes it whispers, but privately they feel the clock ticking louder. The media senses the hesitation, the subtle shift from shock to skepticism, headlines softening, commentators asking whether the confession is credible, whether police are chasing ghosts, and that skepticism seeps back into the investigation, infecting conversations, making every decision feel heavier, because no one wants to be the one who believed too much or too little. Then a small thing happens, the kind that barely registers at first. An old witness, someone who ignored calls years ago, finally agrees to talk, motivated by the renewed attention or perhaps by age, by the sense that secrets grow heavier when you know you won't carry them much longer, and in a quiet room they recount a memory that doesn't match the official timeline, a glimpse of the missing woman later than anyone thought, arguing with someone near a building entrance that had never been flagged before. This memory is fragile, contested by time, but it opens a door investigators didn't know existed, pushing the window of disappearance forward, shifting the map of possibilities, and suddenly the caller's story doesn't fit as neatly. His claim of where and when beginning to strain under the weight of this new account, and tension spikes as detectives realize they may have anchored too much on the confession too early. They return to that building, now renovated, its entrance brighter, cleaner, almost unrecognizable, and they talk to current residents who know nothing of what happened there 20 years ago. Unaware that their hallway might have witnessed the last moments of a life that vanished into rumor, and standing there, detectives feel the eerie dissonance of time, the way tragedy can be paved over without ceremony. Back at the precinct, arguments sharpen, some pushing to pivot away from the confession, others insisting it remains the strongest thread, and the case splinters internally, teams working parallel angles that rarely converge. Each convinced their path is the one that matters, and this fragmentation mirrors the investigation's earliest days, the same mistakes threatening to repeat themselves, the same chaos creeping back in. The caller senses the shift, his lawyer requesting limits, conditions, distance, and detectives know leverage is slipping, because without corroboration his confession is just a story, and stories are easy to disown when they become inconvenient. And still they press, re-interviewing him with the new witness account, watching closely as his reactions change, noting the micropauses, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flicker when confronted with details he didn't expect to hear. He falters, not dramatically, not enough to declare a lie, but enough to raise alarms, enough to suggest either faulty memory or deliberate omission, and detectives leave the room feeling the familiar mix of excitement and dread, the sense that they're close to something important or dangerously off course. As days blur together, sleep becomes a luxury, the case invading dreams, every street corner and stairwell replaying in the mind, and detectives remind themselves why they do this, why reopening a cold case matters even when it hurts. Because unresolved violence stains a city in ways statistics can't measure, because unanswered questions echo longer than gunshots, and because somewhere in this mess of half-truths and fading memories there is still a single, unbroken line of events waiting to be traced. The rain stops, the city dries, and the investigation reaches a strange plateau, no longer racing forward, not yet sliding back, suspended in a tense equilibrium, and everyone involved feels it, the calm before either a collapse or a breakthrough. Knowing from experience that when cold cases move like this, when the air feels charged and uncertain, it usually means the past is about to push back, hard, forcing a reckoning that will either finally expose what happened that night in 2001 or seal it away forever, leaving behind only the echo of a confession that came too late to save anyone and too early to tell whether it was the truth. By the time the investigation reaches its 4th month after reopening, fatigue has settled into everyone's bones, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep because it isn't physical. It's the exhaustion of circling the same unanswered questions while the city outside keeps breathing, keeps changing, keeps daring the past to catch up. The case file grows thicker, heavier, but clarity remains elusive, and detectives start to feel that familiar, dangerous temptation to force connections, to make the pieces fit simply because they need them to. Because a cold case reopened without resolution is a wound torn open twice. The witness who placed her later in the night becomes a pivot point, their memory replayed, tested, challenged, and defended in equal measure, detectives asking the same questions again and again, shifting angles, altering phrasing, watching carefully for cracks that signal invention rather than recollection, and yet the witness holds steady, unsure of the date, but firm about the argument, about the tension in the air, about the way the woman's voice carried anger mixed with fear, a sound that lingered long enough to lodge in memory for 2 decades. It's not proof, but it's something new, and in a case this old, new is dangerous. The confession now looks less like a key and more like a trap, something that may have pulled investigators toward a narrative that doesn't quite line up with reality, and this realization stings, because resources have been poured into chasing that voice on the phone. That midnight admission that promised so much and delivered so little. Detectives debate quietly whether the caller is lying outright, reshaping his role, or telling a version of the truth that places him close enough to feel guilt, but far enough to avoid responsibility, and no one likes any of the options. They begin reconstructing the night again, this time with the timeline shifted, layering witness statements like transparent sheets over a map of the neighborhood, lines crossing and diverging, moments stretching and contracting as memories are weighed against one another, and slowly a new picture emerges. One where the woman doesn't disappear abruptly but moves, argues, hesitates, and lingers in places previously dismissed. This version of events suggests contact, not a sudden abduction, a confrontation that unfolds in stages, each one offering opportunities for intervention that never came. Attention shifts to the building where the argument was reportedly seen, its past tenants traced through old lease records, its maintenance logs examined for anomalies, and in that process a name surfaces that sends a quiet ripple through the team. Someone who lived there briefly in 2001, whose presence overlaps both the confession timeline and the witness account. Someone who moved out shortly after the disappearance without forwarding information. It's not enough to call him a suspect, but it's enough to make him impossible to ignore. Finding him takes time, addresses outdated, phone numbers disconnected, social media sparse, and when detectives finally track him down, he greets them with practiced politeness that feels rehearsed, a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, insisting he barely remembers that year, that building, that woman, and yet when pressed, he recalls oddly specific details about the neighborhood, the noise, the foot traffic, the constant tension of living there, details that suggest memory has not faded, as much as he claims. Interviews with him reveal contradictions subtle enough to evade easy accusation, but consistent enough to raise alarms, small shifts in timing, in phrasing, in emotional tone, and detectives leave each session with the uneasy sense that he is hiding something. Not necessarily murder, not necessarily the worst outcome imaginable, but something that ties him to that night more tightly than he wants to admit. And in a cold case, proximity is often as damning as guilt. The caller hears about this new angle through his lawyer, and his response is immediate, a sudden eagerness to talk again, to clarify, to adjust his statement, and detectives recognize the move for what it is: an attempt to regain control of a narrative slipping out of his hands. He now downplays his earlier claims, reframes his involvement as concern rather than action, insists he only followed because he was worried, insists he left before anything serious happened, and that insistence feels louder than truth. Tension inside the precinct sharpens as teams compare notes, some convinced the confession was a red herring, others believing it still holds a crucial piece of the puzzle, and this internal divide threatens progress because cold cases demand unity. A shared belief in direction, and right now direction feels fractured. Supervisors step in, urging caution, reminding everyone how easily reopened cases implode under the weight of competing theories, how often the desire for resolution clouds judgment. Outside, the family waits, again, suspended between updates and silence, their trust in the system stretched thin by years of waiting, and now by the spectacle of renewed attention, and every time the phone rings their hearts jolt, bracing for news that could finally end the story or drag it on in a new, cruel way. They are careful not to hope too loudly, not to speak certainty into a universe that has already taken too much from them. As the investigation grinds on, small details begin to resonate differently: the cleaning solution smell in the apartment, the loose window latch, the scuff by the door. Elements once cataloged and forgotten now re-examined in light of a scenario involving someone she knew, someone she argued with, someone who might have been let inside willingly. This reframing doesn't answer the central question of what happened to her, but it narrows the field of possibility, and narrowing is a form of progress, however painful. Detectives test this theory quietly, re-interviewing friends about relationships she kept private, disputes she downplayed, tensions she might not have wanted to share, and in those conversations a picture emerges of a woman under pressure, juggling obligations and expectations, not reckless, not naive, but human, capable of trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. It's a reminder that victims are often complex in ways that headlines flatten, and that complexity can obscure truth as much as it reveals it. Late one night, as files are stacked and lights dimmed, a detective lingers over a photograph taken early in the case, the woman smiling on a city street, unaware of the scrutiny that image would endure. And the detective feels the weight of responsibility settle heavier than before. The knowledge that reopening a cold case isn't just about solving a puzzle, it's about honoring a life interrupted, and that knowledge fuels a resolve that cuts through exhaustion. The investigation now sits at a crossroads, the confession weakened, but not discarded, new persons of interest emerging but not yet solid, the timeline reshaped but still incomplete. And everyone involved senses that the next step will determine whether this case finally moves toward truth or slips back into the cold, carrying with it another layer of doubt and disappointment. And as the city outside hums through another night, indifferent and relentless, the question lingers in every silent hallway of the precinct, not just who did this, but whether time itself will allow the answer to surface before memory, evidence, and opportunity vanish completely. The fifth phase of the reopened investigation unfolds without announcement, without a headline, the way the most consequential shifts often do, quietly, almost invisibly. As if the case itself is wary of drawing attention to what might finally be a real turn. Inside the precinct, conversations lower in volume, strategies tighten, and the chaos of competing theories begins to compress into something more focused, more dangerous, because now the detectives are no longer chasing everything, they are circling something. It starts with a detail so mundane it had survived 2 decades without triggering alarm. A utility record tied to the building where the argument was reportedly seen, a brief service interruption logged the same night the woman vanished, a window of time when the lights in part of the stairwell went out. At first it reads like nothing, just another piece of urban inconvenience, but when overlaid onto the revised timeline, it changes the texture of that night, transforming an ordinary space into a pocket of darkness. A place where voices could rise without witnesses, where fear could sharpen quickly. Detectives walk the stairwell again, counting steps, measuring distances, imagining the sound of shoes on concrete in the dark, and they realize how easily a confrontation could escalate there. How quickly panic could turn to violence without anyone outside noticing. The building's renovation has erased much of the original layout, but enough remains to understand how the shadows once fell, and understanding brings discomfort, because it makes the scenario feel plausible, too plausible. The man who lived there briefly in 2001 becomes the center of gravity, not officially named, not publicly acknowledged, but increasingly unavoidable in internal discussions. His timeline intersects too many points now, his memories too selectively sharp, and when detectives compare his statements with those of the witness and the caller, they find overlaps that can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He denies knowing the woman, denies any argument, denies involvement, but denial is not the same as distance, and proximity has a way of closing in. Investigators dig deeper into his life at the time, tracing his movements through old employment records, bank statements, anything that can still be resurrected from the analog graveyard of early 2000s documentation. And what they find is incomplete but suggestive, unexplained gaps, days without records, a sudden change in routine shortly after the disappearance. None of it proves anything, but it begins to outline a shape, and that shape is troubling. The caller reacts poorly when confronted indirectly with this shift, his tone hardening, his cooperation narrowing to what his lawyer allows, and detectives sense fear now, not just guilt or remorse, but fear of being eclipsed, fear that whatever role he played, however minor or major, is about to be redefined without his consent. He insists again that he left early, that he didn't see what happened next, that he only heard about it later, but the insistence rings hollow, rehearsed, as if he's trying to stay ahead of a story that's no longer his to tell. Tension inside the team sharpens into something brittle, because focusing on one person means letting go of others, and letting go feels risky in a case that has punished certainty before. Some investigators worry they are narrowing too soon, that they are building a narrative because it finally feels coherent, not because it's proven, and those worries echo late at night when exhaustion strips away confidence and leaves only doubt. Meanwhile, the family is briefed in cautious tones, told there is movement but not resolution, that names are being looked at but nothing can be shared, and they nod, practiced at absorbing non-answers. But inside, the hope they've kept sealed for years begins to push back against restraint. They ask questions they've asked before, the same ones that never had answers, and hearing them again underscores how little closure time alone can provide. As detectives press forward, they uncover a forgotten report from the early days of the case, an anonymous tip logged and dismissed because it lacked specifics, describing a man seen cleaning a stairwell late that night, unusually late, with a strong chemical smell. At the time, it was written off as a building superintendent or a tenant tidying up, but now, paired with the utility outage and the witness account, it pulses with new significance. The smell matches the one noted in the woman's apartment, the cleaning solution that seemed out of place, and suddenly 2 distant dots draw closer. The report doesn't name the man, but it places him in the building during the critical window, and detectives comb through old tenant lists again, comparing descriptions, searching for anyone who fits. The brief resident surfaces once more, his physical description aligning just enough to send a chill through the room. It's still circumstantial, still fragile, but the pieces are beginning to resonate with each other, and resonance is dangerous because it creates momentum. Surveillance follows, quiet and legal, watching how he moves now, how he reacts to subtle pressure, how his behavior shifts when he senses scrutiny. He is careful, almost too careful, his routines rigid, predictable, and that rigidity reads as control rather than innocence to seasoned eyes. They watch him check over his shoulder, watch him flinch when approached unexpectedly, small tells that could mean nothing or everything, and the uncertainty gnaws at everyone involved. Inside, interviews grow sharper, less forgiving, questions pressing closer to the edge of accusation without crossing it, and he responds with practiced calm that occasionally cracks, irritation bleeding through when asked about that year, that building, that night. He insists again that he moved out because of noise, because of stress, because the place wasn't good for him, explanations that sound reasonable until stacked together, until they begin to feel like a script. The caller's role continues to degrade under scrutiny, his original confession now viewed as an incomplete truth at best, a shield at worst, and detectives suspect he may have been present, may have witnessed something he didn't cause but didn't stop, a position that carries its own weight of guilt and fear. That possibility complicates everything, because witnesses who stay silent for 20 years are often as haunted as perpetrators, and extracting truth from them requires navigating shame as much as deception. As pressure mounts, the investigation reaches outward again, searching for physical proof that can anchor these narratives to reality, returning to sites long thought exhausted, using modern techniques to scan soil, drains, voids between structures where something could have been hidden temporarily. Each search is a test of resolve, because failure chips away at confidence, and success threatens to unleash consequences no one can fully control. Days stretch into weeks, and the case begins to feel alive in a new way, not frantic, not stalled, but coiled, like something preparing to strike. Detectives feel it in their gut, that subtle shift when an investigation stops wandering and starts converging, and that convergence is both exhilarating and terrifying, because it means the end is no longer abstract, it's approaching. And endings in cases like this are rarely clean. Late one evening, a supervisor calls a small group into a closed room, laying out the connections plainly, no speculation, just facts aligned in sequence, and in that room the weight of what they might be approaching settles heavily. They are still missing the final link, the undeniable proof that turns suspicion into truth, but for the first time in years, the path forward feels narrow instead of endless. Outside, the city moves on, oblivious, lights glowing in windows where people argue, laugh, fall asleep, unaware that a story from 2001 is inching closer to its reckoning. Inside the precinct, the cold case hums with tension, no longer dormant, no longer merely reopened, but actively resisting resolution, and everyone involved knows that the next move, the next question asked, the next silence broken, could either finally bring the truth into the light or collapse the fragile structure they've built, sending the case back into the shadows where it has waited, patient and unforgiving, for more than 20 years. By the sixth stretch of the investigation, the air inside the precinct feels pressurized, every conversation carrying an edge, every decision weighed twice before it's spoken aloud, because now the case isn't drifting, it's tightening, and tightening brings risk. The supervisors want certainty, the public wants answers, the family wants truth, and the detectives know that certainty is the one thing a cold case almost never gives freely. The focus narrows further, not announced, not documented in any single memo, but understood, the way experienced teams communicate without words. The brief resident from the building is no longer just a person of interest in theory. He is a gravitational pull, everything bending subtly toward him, and yet nothing can be done openly, not yet, because suspicion without proof is a liability. And one wrong step could fracture the fragile momentum they've built. They begin with time, dissecting it mercilessly, minute by minute, cross-referencing every available record, transit logs, building access data, maintenance schedules, anything that can still be resurrected from a city that archives everything and remembers nothing. The goal is simple but brutal. Place him definitively in that stairwell during the outage, place the woman there too, and show that no one else could have intervened. Simple in theory, devastatingly complex in reality. A breakthrough threatens to surface and then retreats, an old swipe card record from a nearby office building suggesting movement at a time that conflicts with his account, but the system was unreliable back then, data incomplete. And the defense implications loom immediately, because every piece of evidence must withstand not just scrutiny but attack. Detectives feel the frustration clawing back, the fear that the case is once again brushing up against its limits. The caller re-enters the picture in an unexpected way, reaching out through his lawyer with an offer to cooperate more fully, a sudden willingness to clarify details he previously hedged around. The timing is suspicious, too convenient, and detectives suspect he senses the walls closing in, that he understands his silence may soon cost him more than his words ever could. They agree to listen, cautiously, aware that desperation can produce truth or fiction in equal measure. In a recorded session, his demeanor shifts again, less guarded, more brittle, and when pressed about the building, about the stairwell, about the outage, he admits to being there, admits to seeing the woman arguing with someone else, admits to leaving because he was scared. He stops short of naming the man, but the outline is unmistakable now, and in that room the silence that follows is heavy, because this is the closest anyone has come to placing two people together in the same moment, in the same dark space. The admission doesn't solve anything on its own, but it recalibrates the entire investigation. The caller is no longer just a confessor. He is a witness, compromised and unreliable, but potentially crucial, and that dual role complicates strategy. Because witnesses who waited 20 years to speak often do so out of self-preservation as much as conscience. Detectives must now navigate the thin line between extracting truth and offering incentives they may later regret. Meanwhile, the man at the center of suspicion feels the shift, even if he doesn't know its full shape. Surveillance notes a change in behavior, routines disrupted, sudden travel plans that are quickly canceled, phone calls made late at night, anxiety leaking through the cracks of his controlled exterior. He hasn't been accused, hasn't been named, but he senses attention, and attention alone can be destabilizing. The family is informed again, this time with more gravity, told that the case is moving into a critical phase, that things may happen quickly or not at all, and they listen, faces tight with restraint, because they have learned not to react until something is real. For them, hope is dangerous, something that has hurt them before, and they carry it now like a fragile object they don't dare set down. Inside the team, debate intensifies over next steps, whether to push harder on the witness-confessor, whether to confront the suspected resident directly with the new admission, whether to wait for something more concrete. There is no consensus, only urgency, and urgency has a way of forcing decisions that hindsight will later dissect mercilessly. They choose a measured approach, bringing the suspected man back in for another interview, armed with new details, but careful not to reveal their source. The interview room hums with quiet tension, and as questions close in, his composure falters more noticeably this time. He denies involvement, but his denials are sharper, defensive, tinged with anger rather than confusion, and when asked about the outage, his reaction is immediate, eyes flicking away, breath hitching for a fraction of a second too long. It's not enough for an arrest, not even close, but it's enough to confirm what many already feel, that the truth is no longer abstract, it's personal, it has a face, a voice, a history. Detectives leave the room knowing they've crossed an invisible threshold, that the man understands he is being watched, and that understanding can provoke mistakes. As days pass, the investigation leans heavily on patience, watching, waiting, listening, hoping for a slip, a contradiction, something that transforms suspicion into evidence. Every phone call, every movement is logged, and the monotony of surveillance sets in, broken only by bursts of adrenaline when something almost happens, when it feels like the dam might finally crack. Then, quietly, another piece emerges, not dramatic, not headline-worthy, a discarded receipt found in an old box of personal effects, placing the suspected man near the building later than he claimed, the ink faded but legible. The timestamp stubborn and unforgiving. It's circumstantial, but it's real, something that can be shown, something that doesn't rely on memory or confession, and in a case starved for tangible proof, it feels like oxygen. The team rallies around it, building context, corroborating where they can, and the mood shifts again, cautious but energized, because this is how cold cases turn. Not with one explosive revelation, but with a slow accumulation of facts that leave fewer and fewer places to hide. They know they are still missing the final piece, the undeniable link to what ultimately happened to the woman, but for the first time the path feels solid underfoot. As the sixth phase draws to a close, the case stands on the brink of something irreversible. The suspects are restless, the witnesses are fraying, the evidence is aligning, and the city, unaware and indifferent, continues to hum around a story that refuses to stay buried. Inside the precinct, the detectives feel the weight of what's coming, the sense that the next move will not just shape the outcome of this case, but define how justice looks when it arrives 20 years late, carrying with it the cost of every moment spent in silence. The city doesn't announce when it's about to turn on you, it just changes temperature, the air a fraction colder, the light a fraction harsher, and in the days after the faded receipt surfaces, everyone in that squad feels it. Like the case has stopped being an old story and started behaving like a living thing, reacting, resisting, trying to slip away again. The receipt sits under glass like a relic, timestamp stubborn, ink half-bled but readable, and the simplest implication is the most explosive one. He lied about where he was. He lied about when he left, and lies in a cold case don't just raise suspicion. They redraw the entire night. They move carefully at first, because careful is what keeps a case intact when it finally gets traction, and traction is what a defense will try to shred. Detectives trace the receipt back, confirm the store still exists under a different name, confirm the register system used back then, confirm the pattern of timestamps, the way numbers were printed, and every confirmation feels like tightening a bolt. They rebuild the transaction from fragments, the item code, the total amount, the cashier shift logs if they can find them, and the process is tedious, almost absurd, but it matters because in court absurd details can become anchors. If they can show he was there at that time, near that place, then every statement he gave about the night becomes suspect, and suspects become targets. Surveillance is stepped up, quiet and constant, watching his apartment building, his commute, the places he stops where he thinks no one is watching, and what they see is subtle, but significant. He starts checking exits more often, looking at reflections in windows, pausing at corners as if listening for footsteps that aren't there. He begins making late-night trips that don't fit his routine, driving without obvious destination, circling blocks, doubling back, the kind of movement that screams anxiety to people who've watched guilty men try to outpace their own fear. And fear is useful. Fear makes people make mistakes. The caller witness is brought in again, not because detectives want to rely on him, but because they need to pin his story to something real, something that doesn't float on memory alone. His lawyer is present, arms crossed, eyes sharp, and the caller's face looks thinner than before, as if confession has hollowed him out rather than relieved him. He says he remembers a smell in that stairwell, harsh, chemical, like bleach or industrial cleaner, and the detail hits the room like a slap because it echoes the early notes, the too-sharp cleaning scent in the missing woman's apartment, the anonymous tip about someone cleaning late. He didn't know those notes existed, at least he shouldn't, and the fact that he says it now makes the hair rise on the backs of necks. Detectives ask him to close his eyes and describe the argument, not the words, not the motives, but the physicality, the distance between bodies, the way their voices bounced off walls. He says the woman backed away, hand on the railing, and the man stepped closer, blocking the landing, and his voice drops when he says it, as if he's watching it again in his head and doesn't like what he sees. He says he heard a sound, not a scream, not a clear cry, but a sharp gasp that turned into nothing, and then a thud that felt wrong in a space that small. He says he froze. He says he left. He says he's hated himself for leaving ever since. And when detectives ask the question they've been holding back, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you tell anyone? He doesn't have an answer that satisfies anyone. Only excuses shaped by fear and youth and the panic of being dragged into something you didn't intend to witness. It's not a body. It's not a confession to murder. But it's the closest anyone has come to describing the moment the city swallowed her. It gives investigators a scene, a physics of violence, an outline of how the night could have turned fatal without a witness hearing a full scream. In that stairwell, with power out, with the city noise outside muffling everything, a single impact could erase a life. They need more than outline. They need proof. So they go back to the building's bones. Renovation has changed the skin, but the structure holds old secrets if you know where to look. They pull permits, find blueprints, compare before and after layouts, identify void spaces, maintenance shafts, cavities behind walls that would have been accessible in 2001 and sealed later. They consult engineers, building inspectors, anyone who can tell them what stayed the same underneath the fresh paint. And the moment they find a discrepancy, a section of wall thickened during renovation, a sealed door that once led to a utility nook, the room goes quiet. Because thickened walls are where stories hide. They can't just tear into a building on instinct. They need a warrant, and warrants need justification that will survive scrutiny. They assemble it like a weapon, every piece of evidence arranged with care, the revised timeline, the witness who saw the argument, the utility outage record, the anonymous cleaning tip, the chemical smell, the receipt placing the suspect near the location at the critical time, the caller witness placing him in the stairwell with the woman. Each element alone is weak, but together they create a pattern that looks increasingly like truth. The prosecutor reads it slowly, eyes narrowing, and says what everyone is thinking without daring to say out loud. If this is real, the building itself might still hold her. The warrant is approved, and even before the ink dries, tension spikes, because executing a search like this is a line you don't uncross. Once you walk into that building with uniforms and equipment, everyone will know the past is being dug up. The media will sniff it out. The suspect will feel it. The city will talk. And when the city talks, people who have stayed quiet for 20 years either come forward or run. They plan the entry like it's a raid, not because they expect gunfire, but because they expect chaos. They coordinate with building management, keep details vague, cite structural inspection, anything to minimize panic, but rumors move faster than paperwork. By the time they arrive, there are already residents watching from windows, phones held up like offerings, the street crowding with curiosity that feels almost predatory. A cold case reopened is entertainment to people who weren't cut by it, and detectives hate that, hate the way tragedy becomes content, but they push forward because the work matters more than the spectacle. Inside, the stairwell smells like fresh paint and old damp concrete, a mix that makes the stomach tighten. They shut doors, control access, set up lights that flood corners where darkness once hid. A forensics team moves with quiet precision, scanning, tapping walls, listening for hollow spaces. The sound of a hammer against plaster echoes like a heartbeat. The caller's description plays in a detective's mind, hand on the railing, a gasp, a thud, and every time the hammer strikes, it feels like knocking on the past asking if it will finally answer. When they reach the section flagged in the blueprints, the thickened wall, the sealed panel, everyone holds their breath without realizing it. The forensics lead runs a device along the surface, reading density changes, and the numbers shift in a way that makes his expression tighten. He doesn't announce it. He just nods once, and that nod moves through the team like electricity. They mark the area. They photograph everything. They begin removal slowly, layer by layer, as if any sudden movement might shatter what's inside. Dust rises, fine and pale, coating gloves, catching in flashlight beams like snow. The smell changes as they go deeper, a faint chemical note that shouldn't be there, old cleaner trapped behind plaster for years. Outside, the suspect is being watched. He's at work, pretending to be normal, but his phone keeps lighting up with missed calls, messages from someone who heard something, someone who saw police near that building. Surveillance notes his posture stiffen, notes the way he steps away from coworkers, the way he presses his phone hard to his ear, jaw clenched. He leaves early. He drives too fast. He glances at his rearview mirror so often it's almost rhythmic. And as he moves through traffic, the city becomes a maze that can either hide him or trap him, and detectives know that if he runs, it will speak louder than any interview ever did. Back in the building, the wall gives way with a sound like a sigh. A cavity opens, dark and stale, air rushing out that smells of old dampness and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that makes experienced investigators go very still. Flashlights cut into the space, revealing insulation, debris, a jumble of forgotten construction scraps. And then someone spots something that doesn't belong, a strip of fabric caught behind a beam, faded but intact, edges frayed like it was torn in panic. For a moment, no one moves. No one breathes. The fabric is lifted with tweezers like it might shatter, and in that instant the case shifts, not solved, not complete, but transformed. Because fabric can be tested. Fabric can carry fibers, hair, blood, DNA. Fabric is not a story. Fabric is real. The forensics team bags it, seals it, logs it, and the room feels both triumphant and terrified, because finding something means you are closer to a truth that will hurt. Finding something means you might be one step away from finding the worst thing. Detectives exchange glances that say everything without words. If this is hers, the night didn't just end in disappearance, it ended in concealment. Outside, the suspect doesn't go home. He drives to a storage facility on the edge of the city, the kind with rows of metal doors and security cameras that record everything but explain nothing. He parks too far back, walks fast, shoulders hunched, and surveillance watches him punch in a code, slide open a unit, step inside. A few minutes later, he comes out carrying a duffel bag that looks heavier than it should. He loads it into his trunk, hands shaking just enough to notice, and in that movement, in that hurried panic, detectives feel the case tightening into its most dangerous moment. Because men don't visit storage units in a hurry unless they're trying to move something that shouldn't be found. The call comes through to the lead detective as the suspect pulls out of the lot, and the detective's voice stays calm as he issues instructions, but inside, everything is pounding. Because this is the moment where a cold case either finally cracks or scatters its pieces into the wind. Units move to intercept. Lights are kept off. Sirens are held back. The goal is control, not spectacle, because spectacle spooks prey. The suspect merges onto the highway, and the city lights smear into streaks across wet pavement, and the lead detective watches the live feed, heart hammering, knowing that somewhere in that trunk could be the missing link that turns a reopened file into a solved truth. Or could be nothing at all, another dead end dressed up as drama. And as the suspect takes an unexpected exit, heading toward the industrial edge where the river breathes cold and dark under bridges, the detective feels the past lean forward, ready to either confess or vanish again, leaving only the echo of footsteps in a stairwell that went dark for just long enough to erase a life. The exit he takes is wrong in a way that makes every screen in the command room feel suddenly too small, because it isn't toward home or a familiar neighborhood. It's toward the industrial edge where the city stops pretending and shows its ribs, warehouses, chain link, loading docks, sodium lights buzzing over puddles, and under the bridges the river moves like a dark idea, swallowing reflections and returning nothing. The units tail him at a distance, headlights down, spacing precise, a quiet choreography built on patience and nerves, and the lead detective keeps his voice level on the radio because panic is contagious. Because a cold case can be lost in a single rash moment, because if this man realizes he's being followed, he could dump the bag, torch it, throw it into water that carries secrets away like it was built for that purpose. Traffic thins as he turns onto a service road, tires hissing through wet grit, and surveillance catches his hands on the wheel, knuckles white, shoulders locked. He is not driving like someone running errands. He is driving like someone trying to outrun a memory. He checks his mirror again and again, and when he makes a sudden lane change without signaling, it's like watching a crack spread across glass, the first sign that his control is slipping. The detective watches the live map, calculates intersections, exits, dead ends, and somewhere in his gut a familiar dread stirs, the dread that comes from knowing the city can hide people as easily as it hides evidence. That even with a dozen units in motion a man can still vanish into a grid of darkness and steel. They consider stopping him immediately, but stopping him means explaining why, means risking a legal misstep that could poison everything, and this case is too old to survive sloppy work. The lead detective calls the prosecutor, brief and tight, updates relayed in clipped sentences, storage unit, duffel bag, movement toward the river, and the prosecutor's voice is sharp with urgency but careful, reminding them of the line they can't cross. reminding them that suspicion does not equal probable cause unless it can be articulated clearly and cleanly. The detective's joy tightens. He knows that. He also knows that if the suspect reaches the water, whatever is in that trunk could become the river's property. A patrol unit up ahead positions itself in a way that looks accidental, a car angled as if dealing with a stalled vehicle, and the suspect slows, hesitates, then accelerates around it with irritation, and that single maneuver, careless and aggressive, becomes the hook, the justification, the lawful pretext to stop him without revealing the true reason. Lights flare. Not sirens, not yet, just the sudden flash of red and blue against wet asphalt, a jolt of color that turns the industrial night into a stage. The suspect brakes hard. The car sways. For half a second, it looks like he might bolt. Then he pulls over. The moment the car stops, time does that strange thing it always does in high-stakes seconds, stretching and compressing at once. Officers approach, hands visible, voices steady, and the suspect sits rigid, eyes forward, mouth slightly open like he's forgotten how to breathe. The lead detective is listening on the radio, hearing the routine words, license, registration, sir, step out of the vehicle, and beneath those routine words he hears the pulse, the tension. The knowledge that in the trunk could be the missing link to a case that has haunted a family for more than 20 years. The suspect steps out slowly, too slowly, as if moving carefully might slow consequences. His hands tremble when he reaches for his wallet. He forces a laugh that doesn't land. An officer asks him where he's headed at this hour, and he answers with something vague, a friend, a late errand, none of it convincing. The officer notes the smell of chemical cleaner clinging faintly to his clothes, not strong, just a trace, like someone tried to wash away a smell and failed. It's the kind of observation that will matter later, written down, initialed, time-stamped, because in court everything becomes either a weapon or a weakness. AK-9 unit arrives, not dramatic, just a quiet addition to the scene, and the dog circles the car, nose working, body language shifting, and when it sits near the trunk, still and alert, the air changes. That sit isn't a conclusion, it's a signal, a permission to push further, and officers exchange glances that say the same thing, something is back there. But something is not the same as admissible. They call the prosecutor again, this time with the dog alert, with the suspect's evasive answers, with the odd route toward the river, and on the other end there's a pause, a calculated pause where legal thresholds are weighed against the risk of losing evidence forever. The prosecutor authorizes the next step carefully, and officers open the trunk while body cams record every angle, every hand movement, every inch of the latch lifting. Because 20 years from now someone will still be arguing about what happened in this moment. The trunk is cluttered, ordinary junk first, a folded umbrella, an old jacket, a toolbox, and then the duffel bag, black, scuffed, sitting like an accusation. An officer lifts it by the strap. It sags with weight. The zipper is half closed. A cold wind slides under the bridge, and for a second it feels like the city itself is holding its breath. They place the bag on the wet asphalt, hands gloved, and the zipper sound is too loud in the night, that rough metallic rasp, and when it opens the contents spill into view not as a body, not as bones, not as the clean ending everyone fears and craves, but as a mess of objects that feel both random and deliberate. Inside are clothes, folded tight, a hoodie, jeans, gloves, the kind of work gloves used for moving heavy things, and a bottle of industrial cleaner wrapped in a plastic bag. And the sight of that bottle hits like a punch because it is the physical embodiment of the scent that kept surfacing, the bleach-like smell in the apartment, the anonymous tip, the caller's memory in the stairwell. There's also a roll of heavy-duty trash bags, unused, and a coil of rope still wrapped in packaging, and beside it a cheap burner phone, its screen dark, battery removed, as if someone understood exactly what investigators look for when they get close. Nothing in the bag is illegal on its own. That is the cruelty of it. These are ordinary tools of ordinary work, cleaning, moving, throwing away, and yet in the context of this case they look like staging, like preparation, like a mind trying to control an outcome. The suspect's face strains when he sees the bag open, and for a moment his mask slips, eyes wide with something raw. He starts talking fast, too fast, trying to explain the cleaner, the rope, the bags, insisting he's doing renovations, he's helping a friend. He keeps supplies in storage. He's always prepared. And the words tumble out in a frantic stream that makes officers glance at each other, because innocent people rarely narrate their innocence like they're reading a script at gunpoint. They secure the items, bagging everything, photographing, labeling, the choreography of evidence collection practiced and relentless, and as they do, the suspect's voice rises, anger now, indignation, demanding to know why he's being stopped, why he's being treated like a criminal, and an officer replies with calm firmness, routine procedure, traffic violation, suspicious materials, sir, and the suspect laughs again, sharp and brittle, the laugh of someone who knows the routine is a lie and also knows the lie is what keeps the case from collapsing. They can detain him, question him, but they cannot yet charge him with what everyone in that moment is thinking, and that gap between suspicion and charge is where cold cases often rot. The lead detective arrives on scene, raincoat slick with water, eyes scanning the evidence laid out like a grim inventory, and he feels both a surge of triumph and a chill of frustration, because the bag suggests intent but not outcome, preparation but not proof of what happened to the missing woman. It is a step forward and a wall at the same time. Back at the building search site, the fabric strip is already on its way to the lab, sealed, logged, treated like it might be the one thing that can bridge decades. Detectives need it to speak. They need it to carry her DNA, her blood, something undeniable. Without that, the case remains a storm of strong implications and weak conclusions. The suspect sits in an interview room later, fluorescent light flattening his face, lawyer beside him now, posture rigid, and he refuses to answer questions about the stairwell, about the outage, about the woman. He repeats the same line like a mantra, I don't know her, I wasn't there, I want my attorney. His eyes flicker once when the detective mentions the cleaner in his trunk. It's a flicker that could mean anything. That's another cruelty. Everything could mean anything until evidence turns it into only one thing. News leaks anyway, because it always does, and by morning the vans are back, headlines splashed again across phones and TV screens, cold case search, police stop suspect near river, mysterious duffel bag seized, and the city reacts the way it always does, with fascination that blurs into rumors hardening into certainties without proof. People online start naming him before police do, start building stories out of partial truths, and detectives grit their teeth because public noise can spook witnesses, contaminate testimony, push people into hiding. The family sees the headlines and their hearts lurch, and for a moment they allow themselves to imagine the end, the awful end, the truth finally pinned down, and then they hear there's no arrest, no body, no confirmation, and the hope collapses into that familiar ache. The ache of almost. In the lab, technicians work with the fabric like it's fragile history, because it is. They test for blood, for skin cells, for fibers that match clothing described by friends. They compare it to samples taken from the missing woman's belongings, hairbrush, toothbrush, anything stored away by a family that refused to let go of evidence even when the world moved on. The wait for results becomes its own form of torture, not the kind you can dramatize with screams, but the quiet torture of watching a clock while your mind fills the silence with every possible outcome. The suspect is released pending further investigation, because the law is a gatekeeper that doesn't care about dread or intuition, and the moment he steps out of the precinct into daylight, he looks smaller, tighter, like a man trying to keep his life from collapsing by sheer force of will. Surveillance follows again, because now he knows how close the system is, and a man who feels the net tightening often does something desperate. Yet the day passes without fireworks. He goes home. He draws curtains. He makes a phone call that lasts 7 minutes. He doesn't return to the storage unit. He doesn't go near the building. He acts like someone who knows every move is being watched and refuses to give the watchers anything. Inside the squad room, detectives stare at the evidence board and feel the same familiar haunted tension, because they have something real now, fabric, a bag of suspicious supplies, a witness who finally spoke. But they still don't have the one thing that ends a cold case cleanly. They don't have her. They don't have the story of where she went after that stairwell went dark. And the city, indifferent and relentless, keeps moving. The river still rolling under bridges like it has all along, swallowing reflections, returning nothing, while in a lab somewhere a strip of faded cloth sits under sterile light, holding either the truth or another chapter of silence, and everyone involved knows that when the results come back, they won't just decide what happens next, they will decide whether this reopened cold case finally becomes a solved story or remains what it has always been. A missing life suspended in the space between a late-night confession and a city that knows how to keep its secrets. The lab call comes on an afternoon that looks ordinary from the street, sunlight caught in puddles, people moving with groceries and headphones and indifference. But inside the squad room it lands like a gunshot because everyone has been living in the suspended breath of waiting, and when the technician says, "We have a match," the room doesn't cheer, it tightens. Like every muscle in every body has braced for impact. The strip of fabric pulled from the sealed cavity carries her DNA. Not a maybe. Not a statistical shrug. Her skin cells embedded in the weave like the last fingerprint of a life that didn't get to leave a goodbye. And there's more. The technician adds, a faint trace of blood, degraded, old, but present, and the chemical signature on the fibers reads like industrial cleaner. The same harsh profile that has been haunting this case since the first officers stepped into that apartment and wondered why the air smelled too clean. A cold case doesn't end when DNA speaks. It begins to roar. Because DNA is a door, not a destination, and what waits behind it is the hard part, linking a person to a place to a moment to an act that can be proven beyond doubt. Still, the effect is immediate. The board gets updated in sharp marker. The prosecutors who have been hovering at the edges step closer. The family gets a call that makes the mother's knees buckle, even though the words are careful, even though they still don't say where she is, even though they still don't say what happened. All they can say is, "We found something that belonged to her, something that confirms she was there, in that stairwell, in that dark pocket of the city," and in the silence, after the call the family hears what isn't said. That the case has finally moved into the territory of violence. Now the team has enough to push harder. The bag from the trunk isn't just suspicious supplies anymore. It's context. It's behavior. It's a man moving cleaner and rope and trash bags toward the river hours after police began tearing into walls connected to a 20-year-old disappearance. That pattern gets written into a warrant application with language as tight as a noose, and the judge signs it because the story is no longer a ghost story. It's a chain of physical facts. A search of his home. A search of his devices. A full forensic review of that storage unit. And when the paperwork is done, the building feels like it's vibrating, every detective aware that once they open those doors they might find nothing, or they might find the thing that has been missing for 2 decades. The truth, ugly and undeniable. They hit the apartment early, when the city is still half asleep, boots on stairs, radios low, hands steady. The door opens after a long pause, the suspect's face appearing in the crack like he's been expecting them and praying they wouldn't come. He tries to look confused. He tries to look offended. But the second he sees the warrant, his eyes do something small and involuntary, a flicker of calculation, like a man measuring how much of his life is about to be taken apart. They move through the rooms with gloved hands and practice discipline, photographing before touching, cataloging every item, because defense attorneys love chaos, love sloppy searches, love anything that looks like police overreach. They don't give them that gift. In a closet they find cleaning products arranged too neatly, rows of bottles with labels facing outward, almost obsessive. In a drawer they find latex gloves, boxes of them, and a roll of heavy-duty contractor bags identical to the ones in the duffel. In the kitchen trash they find a receipt dated 2 days earlier for industrial cleaner, the same brand, the same concentration. None of it is illegal. All of it feels like a person trying to control contamination. In a bedroom nightstand they find a key with a small metal tag, the storage facility unit number. He said he barely uses it. The key looks worn. They image his laptop. They seize his phone. They take old hard drives and thumbsticks and a stack of papers that include a set of handwritten notes that make the lead detective go very still, because the notes are not a diary, not exactly, but a list of street names and times, written in type block letters. And beside one street name is a single word underlined twice: stairs. He claims it's work-related. He doesn't explain why the handwriting shakes on that line. The storage unit is next. Rows of metal doors under hard fluorescent light, the smell of dust and oil and stale cardboard, and when they open his unit it's filled with ordinary junk stacked into towers like a life compressed into boxes, holiday decorations, old furniture. A bicycle with flat tires, and then something that isn't ordinary, a section of drywall leaning against the back wall, the edges jagged as if it was cut out of somewhere and saved. The forensics team's eyes meet for a beat. Drywall isn't something people store unless they're renovating, or unless they're keeping a piece of something that mattered. They bag it. They swab it. They scan it for trace biological material, and even before results come back, the shape of it looks wrong, like it was taken from a specific place. Hidden under a tarp is a tool chest. Inside are scrapers, putty knives, a small crowbar, a hammer with faint discoloration near the claw that might be rust, might be old blood that has oxidized into anonymity. They take it anyway. They take everything that might speak. A cold case doesn't forgive the mistake of leaving behind the one object that could have ended it. Then they get to the burner phone from the duffel, and this is where the case shifts again, because a phone is a map of intention. Even if the battery was removed, even if the screen is dead, digital forensics is patient. It doesn't care about panic. It doesn't care about lies. It cares about residue. The tech team pulls data from it like lifting fingerprints off glass, partial, fragmented, but enough to reveal a handful of numbers dialed, a few texts deleted but not fully erased, and one location ping that makes the lead detective's stomach drop. A cell tower near a transfer station on the industrial edge, close to where construction debris is sorted before it's hauled out to landfills beyond the city. A place where things disappear into the machinery of waste and never come back. The suspect is brought in again, this time not as a polite interview but as a confrontation wrapped in procedure. His lawyer sits beside him like a shield. The room is cold, the kind of cold that sharpens voices. The detective slides photographs across the table, the fabric strip, the sealed evidence bag, the cavity in the stairwell wall, the duffel contents laid out on asphalt under flashing lights. The suspect stares at the photos without reacting too quickly, trying to look like a man seeing something irrelevant, but his throat moves when the detective places the lab report in front of him, the DNA match to the missing woman. That report is a blade. It slices through vague denials. It makes the past real. You said you didn't know her, the detective says, voice flat. You said you weren't there. Tell me how her DNA ends up behind a wall in a stairwell where you lived. The suspect's mouth opens, closes, opens again. He doesn't answer. He looks at his lawyer. The lawyer tells him not to answer. Silence becomes his strategy. Silence becomes his prison. Outside the room, the team is split between exhilaration and dread. They have proof she was in that stairwell. They have suspicious behavior. They have tools, cleaner, bags, rope, a burner phone. They have a compromised witness who says he heard a thud. And yet they still don't have her. They still can't say where she went after that sound, after that dark moment. They still can't tell the family where to lay flowers. This is the cruel middle of every missing person homicide, the point where the evidence screams violence, but refuses to reveal the final location. And then the lab calls again, quieter this time, with a detail that turns certainty into complication. The fabric doesn't carry only her DNA. It carries a mixed profile, partial male DNA degraded to definitively match a single person, but enough markers to say it is consistent with the suspect. Consistent, not conclusive. It's a word prosecutors hate because it invites doubt like a vampire invited into a house. Defense will say contamination. Defense will say secondary transfer. Defense will say anything that breaks the chain. And the team feels the case wobble on its own progress, because now they are closer than ever and still not over the legal finish line. The compromised witness gets spooked when the news hits. He calls his lawyer. His lawyer calls the detectives. He says he's receiving threats. He says someone left a note on his car, no name, no signature, just 2 words written in thick marker: stay quiet. The detectives don't know if it's the suspect, an associate, or a cruel opportunist feeding off headlines, but the effect is the same. Fear spreads. Fear makes witnesses retract. Fear makes people disappear. They move him into protective measures quietly, because if he vanishes, the narrative loses a pillar. If he recants, defense will feast. This is what cold cases become when they heat up, a chess game played in public, where every piece is human and every move can ruin someone. Meanwhile, search teams pivot toward the transfer station ping. They know it's a long shot. 2 decades have passed. Anything put into that system would have been crushed, buried, compacted under mountains of garbage. But they also know that the suspect's late-night trip toward the river, the duffel bag, the cleaner, the burner phone, it all points to disposal behavior, to a man trying to create distance between himself and whatever happened. They pull old hauling records. They track which facilities were operating in 2001. They identify routes from the neighborhood to industrial drop sites. They build a list of probable locations like a set of coordinates for despair. The family hears about none of this in real time. They get sanitized updates, careful phrasing, and in the gaps between those phrases their minds fill with horror. They imagine the stairwell. They imagine the thud. They imagine walls closing. They imagine trash compactors. They imagine a river swallowing. The mother sits at a table and traces the edge of a faded missing poster kept in a drawer for 20 years, her fingers memorizing the outline as if it might keep her daughter from disappearing again. By the end of the 9th movement of this reopened case, the investigation feels both unstoppable and precarious, a locomotive racing on tracks that might not reach a destination. The suspect remains uncharged, shielded by law and ambiguity. The evidence grows stronger, then fuzzier, then stronger again. The witness is frightened. The city is loud with rumors. And somewhere out beyond the bright parts of Manhattan, machinery still chews through waste, the river still moves under bridges, and a transfer station sits like a mouth at the edge of the city, swallowing what people can't bear to keep. The detectives stand in that tension, aware that one more lab result could turn consistent into match, that one more witness could turn fear into truth. That one overlooked record could point to a place where the missing woman has been waiting in silence since 2001, and as the night settles over New York again, the cold case doesn't feel cold anymore, it feels hot enough to burn. Hot enough to finally expose what was done in the dark, or hot enough to consume the last fragile threads before they can be tied into an ending. The search begins at a place the city pretends not to see, a transfer station where trash becomes anonymous, where last night's secrets are crushed into morning's routine. And the air tastes like metal and rot under sodium lights that make everything look sickly and unreal. Trucks roll in with their loads, compactors groan like tired animals, and investigators move through it all wearing gloves and masks and that hard, controlled expression people wear when they're trying not to imagine what they might find. Every step here feels like walking into a mouth, and the mouth has been chewing for 20 years. They don't come with illusions. They come with probabilities, with math, with logistics, with old hauling records that feel like ancient scripture, and a single digital breadcrumb from a burner phone that shouldn't have been able to speak at all. A ping near this place isn't proof of disposal, but it's the kind of behavior that matches the psychology of panic. If you want something gone, you put it into the city's bloodstream of waste and let it carry the burden away. The detectives stand at the edge of the machinery and understand the brutality of what they're asking time to do, to give back what it has buried under layers of routine, to cough up a truth it has been digesting since 2001. On paper, the plan is clinical. Identify the likely route from the neighborhood to industrial drop sites operating at the time, narrow to specific dates, match to shifts, locate old landfill cells associated with those loads if possible. In practice, it's an excavation of despair. Records are incomplete. Companies folded. Contracts changed. Landfills expanded and relayered. The earth itself reorganized. Still, they push because the case has reached that stage where you either chase the long shot or admit you've run out of road. The witness who finally spoke is moved quietly, not under flashing lights or public announcement, just a change of address and a sense of watching eyes. He sits in a safe room and stares at the wall, hands shaking around a paper cup of water, and tells detectives the threats are getting worse. Anonymous calls that hang up when he answers, footsteps behind him that stop when he turns. The kind of paranoia that feels insane until you remember how many people have killed to keep a secret intact. He asks them if they think he's going to die for saying what he saw, and the detective answers with practiced calm, telling him they're taking precautions, telling him he did the right thing, but inside the detective feels the old anger rise. The fury at how violence doesn't stop with the act itself, it spreads, it poisons, it reaches forward in time to punish anyone who tries to tell the truth. The suspect, meanwhile, lives inside a tightening circle. His devices are being torn apart by digital forensics, his storage unit cataloged down to the dust, his name murmured more often in rooms where people used to speak about him like a distant possibility. He can feel the shift, and he responds the way people do when cornered. He becomes smaller in some ways, more careful, less visible, and in other ways he becomes erratic, emotional spikes in phone calls, brief trips that make no sense. Late-night walks as if movement itself can outrun consequence. Surveillance logs it all, the banal choreography of a man trying to keep his world from collapsing. In the lab, the mixed DNA profile becomes the battleground, because consistent is not match, and defense attorneys live in that space like it's oxygen. The prosecution needs something cleaner, something sharp, something that will hold under cross-examination. They send the fabric back for additional testing, deeper analysis, different amplification methods, anything that might pull clarity out of decay. They test the drywall found in the storage unit. They swab the tools. They isolate trace. They compare. They wait. Waiting becomes its own kind of violence, a slow squeeze on the heart. And all the while the city talks. It talks in headlines and whispers and anonymous posts. It talks in barbershops and group chats and late-night radio, and each repetition distorts the truth further, turning uncertainty into certainty, turning rumor into verdict, turning a woman's disappearance into a spectacle. Detectives hate that noise because noise makes witnesses hide, makes people choose silence over scrutiny, and the case is already fighting time. It doesn't need the public adding fear. Then the investigation hits a wall that isn't physical but legal, a procedural minefield. The suspect's attorney challenges aspects of the stop, the search, the scope of warrants, arguing over language, over timing, over whether the dog alert was sufficient, whether the seizure of the duffel contents was justified. It's the kind of battle that looks petty to outsiders and is existential to a case like this. If key evidence is suppressed, the investigation could be gutted. The prosecutor's office responds with meticulous documentation, body cam footage, chain of custody logs, affidavits written with the precision of surgeons. The detectives watch this fight from the sidelines with clenched jaws, because the law isn't just a weapon for justice, it's also a shield for the guilty, and in cold cases that shield often outlasts memory. The family doesn't see the legal drama. They see only the emotional whiplash, a reopened cold case, a shocking confession, a building search, DNA confirmation, a suspect in focus, and still no arrest, still no remains, still no sentence to attach to the years they've lost. The mother begins waking at 3 a.m. every night, as if her body has synchronized with the hour of the original call, the hour when truth tried to enter the world and stumbled. She sits in the kitchen and listens to the refrigerator hum, imagining her daughter's footsteps in a stairwell that went dark, imagining the moment where the argument turned, imagining the thud, the silence, the aftermath that the city swallowed whole. Investigators revisit the stairwell again, because that space has become the crucible, the place where the story seems to converge. They map angles, distances, potential trajectories of a fall or a shove, and they bring in specialists who can speak the cold language of physics without flinching. Could a shove produce that kind of impact without a scream? Could someone lose consciousness without leaving obvious blood? How would someone move a body from that spot unnoticed? Every answer is partial, conditional, wrapped in variables, and yet the specialists keep returning to the same grim conclusion. It's possible, frighteningly possible, for a life to end in that dark pocket without the city hearing it. Late one night, a new lead surfaces not from technology, but from guilt. A former tenant from the building calls in after seeing the story blow up again, someone who lived a floor above the stairwell in 2001. His voice is old, uneasy, like he's dragging a memory out of a basement. He says there was a smell that week, a harsh chemical smell in the hall, stronger than usual, and he remembers hearing scraping, like something heavy being dragged or pushed, late at night. He didn't report it then because the city was loud with bigger fears, because everyone had their own survival to manage, because you don't call the police over scraping sounds and cleaner smell unless you want to be the paranoid neighbor. But now, he says, now he can't stop thinking about it, and his words pour out like confession without a crime. Detectives meet him, record his statement, and the detail slots into the pattern like a missing tooth being replaced. Scraping. Dragging. Chemical. It matches the anonymous tip. It matches the caller witness. It matches the apartment smell. It doesn't prove disposal, but it strengthens the picture of aftermath, of someone trying to erase friction marks and fluid and panic. It gives the prosecution another witness, another human voice to support the physical evidence, and the team feels momentum surge again, fragile but real. The suspect's reaction to this renewed pressure is subtle at first, then sharper. He calls in sick to work. He stays inside with blinds drawn. He makes a trip to the storage facility only to drive past without stopping, like he can't bear to be seen near it again. Surveillance watches him sit in his car for 20 minutes without moving, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, and for a moment the detectives see not just a suspect, but a man wrestling with something heavy and unseen. Whether that something is guilt or fear of being wrongly accused, they can't know. The city doesn't hand out certainty. It forces you to earn it. And then the lab calls with another result that sounds like progress and complication in the same breath. The drywall from the storage unit contains trace biological material. Not enough to identify conclusively, not enough to declare it blood with absolute certainty, but enough to say it warrants deeper testing. The tools show faint traces too, microscopic residues that could be from construction work, from rust, from anything, and yet the pattern is unsettling. The prosecutor's office leans in again, drafting motions, building arguments, preparing for the possibility of an arrest that still feels like stepping onto thin ice. The witness under protection begins to crack, the pressure of being the living hinge of the case crushing him. In an interview, he admits he lied about one small thing early on, not about seeing the argument, not about the thud, but about why he was there at all. He says he had been looking for the woman, not by accident, but because he had met her earlier, because he was obsessed in a harmless way that turned into following, and he feared admitting it would make him look guilty. The confession is humiliating, ugly, and it threatens the case because defense will use it to smear him, to call him a stalker, an unreliable narrator with motive to redirect blame. Detectives sit in silence after he speaks, feeling the floor shift beneath them, because truth is rarely pure, and impurity is what defense thrives on. They have to decide whether to keep him as a pillar or treat him like a cracked support and find other ways to hold the structure up. They choose the only option that keeps the case alive, corroborate everything he says with independent evidence wherever possible, build a framework that doesn't collapse if he is attacked on the stand. It's grueling, slow work. It's also the work that separates a reopened cold case from a reopened tragedy. As the 10th movement of this story grinds toward its end, the investigation sits in a cruel posture, closer than ever, still not at the finish. The stairwell has given up a piece of her. The lab has confirmed what the family feared. The suspect's lies have been exposed in layers. The city's machinery of waste has been searched for a body that may never be recoverable, and yet the central absence remains. The woman herself still missing, still a blank space where closure should be. The detectives feel the case leaning toward an outcome, but they also feel how easily it could slip, how a judge's ruling could suppress a critical piece, how a witness's credibility could crumble, how time can still win even when you think you're finally catching up. And on a night when the city lights reflect off the river like broken glass, The lead detective stands alone by the evidence board and stares at the thin strip of fabric in its photograph, the ragged edge that once clung to a beam behind a wall. And he feels the ache of a truth that is almost within reach but refuses to be grasped. He knows the next step will either change everything or bury it again, because cold cases don't resolve gently. They snap. They break. They leave scars. And somewhere in the city, behind curtains drawn tight, a man sits in darkness listening to the sound of his own breathing, while across town a family sits in a different kind of darkness, waiting for the day when a voice on the phone doesn't just reopen the past, but finally tells them what happened after the stairwell went dark. The judge's ruling comes down on a Thursday that feels too bright for what it does. Winter light bouncing off glass towers like nothing in the world is heavy, like the city has never carried a secret in its mouth. In the courtroom the air is dry, paper thin, every cough too loud, and when the judge speaks it's in measured phrases that sound clinical until you understand what they mean in the language of a cold case. Parts of the stop stand, parts of the seizure stand. But certain items, certain interpretations, will be challenged, limited, narrowed in scope, and that narrowing is how momentum dies in cases like this, not with a bang, not with a confession recanted on camera, but with legal edges sanding down your strongest angles until what's left looks like doubt. Back at the precinct, detectives listen to the summary and feel it like a pressure drop. They still have the fabric, still have her DNA behind that wall, still have chemical residue that matches the story's ugly thread, still have the witness who finally spoke, still have the suspect's lies about his location. But now every piece has to carry more weight because one or two pieces might not be allowed to carry what everyone knows they mean. The prosecutor's voice stays calm on the conference call, says this doesn't end the case, says it changes the shape of it, says they can still build, but the detectives hear what isn't said. A jury doesn't convict on chills and patterns, and cold cases don't get second chances if you bring them to court and lose. They tighten their grip on what cannot be argued away: the wall cavity, the DNA match, the stairwell timeline, the outage record, the new witness who remembers scraping and chemical stink in the hallway. And they go back to the building again because the building is the only thing that never forgot. Residents watch from doorways now with a different kind of curiosity, less entertained, more uneasy, because people don't like learning their home may have held a secret that could still be sealed inside its bones. The forensics team scans deeper, farther, checks adjacent cavities, old chases, voids between studs where something small could have been hidden, a necklace, a phone, a key, anything that might have been lost in panic. Anything that might have dropped and then been sealed behind renovation like a time capsule of fear. They find another scrap, not dramatic, not a smoking gun, a tiny piece of plastic, the corner of something that could be packaging or could be part of a phone case from the early 2000s. And they bag it anyway because in this investigation everything is either meaningless or the missing link, and you don't get to know which until the lab tells you, if the lab can tell you at all. They test for trace, for skin oils, for fingerprints that have survived too long in too much air, and most of it comes back as what the lab always says when time has done its work: insufficient, degraded, inconclusive. Inconclusive becomes the word that starts haunting the team the way the woman's name once did. The witness under protection continues to fray. After admitting he followed her, he becomes a liability the defense can paint in neon colors, and he knows it. You can see it in the way his shoulders tighten when he's asked to repeat the story, in the way his eyes dart toward the door as if he expects someone to step through and punish him for speaking. The threats don't stop. Notes appear in places that make no sense. A voice on the phone breathes and hangs up. No one claims responsibility, which is its own kind of cruelty, because faceless fear is the hardest kind to fight. Detectives offer reassurance, offer protection, but they cannot offer certainty, and he keeps asking for what no one can give. Promise me I won't be the one who goes down for this. The suspect, meanwhile, grows quieter, more sealed. He stops making mistakes. He stops moving at night. He becomes the picture of careful routine, the kind of man who knows that motion creates friction and friction creates evidence. His attorney files motions, requests, challenges, and the case becomes a war fought in paperwork and closed-door meetings as much as in streets and stairwells. Publicly, nothing looks like it's happening. Privately, everything is grinding. The prosecutor wants a clean path to a charge. The detectives want to move while the pressure is still high. The family wants the world to stop holding its breath and finally exhale an answer. And then the lab delivers another partial truth that lands like a stone. Additional testing refines the mixed male profile on the fabric, but it still won't crystallize into a definitive match. It is closer, narrower, more statistically suggestive, but still not the word everyone needs. Not match. Not him beyond doubt. Not the kind of sentence you can build a life sentence around without risking collapse. They pivot to digital again, because digital sometimes remembers what bodies and walls forget. The burner phone gives up one more fragment under deeper recovery, a text string partially reconstructed, characters missing like teeth knocked out, but enough to read the shape of it, a message sent late at night, 2 words intact and chilling in their simplicity. It's done. No recipient name in plain language, just a number, and the number traces back to a prepaid account bought with cash, the kind of ghost number that exists only to avoid being real, but it connects to another tower ping, another location. A corner near an old pier, the kind of place where the city meets water in a way that feels final. Search teams go there with dogs and sonar and divers, because the city demands the ritual even when logic says it's too late. They sweep under the pier where broken bottles glitter in silt, where the river drags debris past rusted beams, where shadows move like living things when your flashlight hits the wrong angle. They find bikes, shopping carts, tangled line, 1,000 small secrets that have nothing to do with this woman, and yet feel like they do because every lost thing in this city carries the same sadness. They do not find her. The landfill search expands, then contracts, because budgets are real and time is ruthless. They identify likely cells from old hauling routes, but those cells have been layered and capped and repurposed, and excavation becomes a political nightmare, an environmental risk, a logistical abyss. They push as far as they can. They pull what they can. They find nothing that can be linked to her, not a bone, not a tooth, not a scrap of clothing that can speak her name into a lab report. The city's machinery of waste has done what it was built to do, erase. As the months turn, the media's appetite shifts, headlines thinning, attention drifting to fresher horrors, and that drift is another kind of violence because it mirrors what happened in 2001. The way a disappearance can become old news while the family's grief stays new every day. The detectives feel the case cooling at the edges even as it remains technically active, and cooling is dangerous because cooling is how urgency gets replaced by paperwork, how people get reassigned, how the reopened file risks becoming a reopened wound with no closure. Then, on a cold morning when the sky hangs low and gray, the family asks for something they have never asked for before: a vigil at the building. Not because they believe she's still there, not because they think candles will bring evidence, but because they need a physical place to pour their waiting into, a place that isn't an empty chair at home or a police station hallway. The detectives attend quietly, standing back, watching the mother step into the stairwell and look up the flights as if she might see her daughter coming down, smiling, apologizing for being late. The mother's hand touches the railing, the metal worn smooth by decades of strangers, and she flinches as if the cold of it is the cold of that night reaching into her palm. People from the building come too, neighbors who didn't live there then, but live there now and suddenly realize their walls have history. Some bring flowers. Some bring silence. The smell in the stairwell is ordinary now, just paint and dust, but the mother keeps shaking her head, whispering that she can still imagine it, the harsh chemical sting. The way the air must have burned the lungs if someone was trying to scrub away the worst moment of her life. A reporter tries to ask a question and is shut down by a detective stare because this isn't content, this is grief. After the vigil, a man approaches the lead detective in the street, older, face pinched with shame. He says he worked maintenance back then, not full-time, just odd jobs, and he remembers being asked to patch a section of wall in that stairwell, late, so late he thought it was strange, and the person who asked him wasn't building management, it was a tenant. A tenant who paid cash and said it was to fix damage from a fall. He says he didn't ask questions because cash is cash, and New York teaches you not to look too hard at other people's problems. He says he remembers the tenant's eyes, wide and flat, not angry, not sad, just focused like someone trying to outrun a clock. The detective feels the case surge again, that familiar electric lift, because this is new, a living memory tied to a physical act, patching a wall. It fits the cavity. It fits the concealment. It fits the idea of a moment that didn't end at the thud, but continued into aftermath and repair and erasure. They take his statement. They cross-check his work logs. They try to verify with anyone else who might remember. But verification is hard when the job was off the books and the payment was cash and the memory is 2 decades old. The man's words are powerful, but power is not the same as proof, and the prosecutor listens and says what no one wants to hear. It helps the narrative. It doesn't close the case. The suspect hears about the vigil, about police returning again, about new witnesses surfacing, and he does the one thing everyone feared he might do when the net tightened. He moves. Not a dramatic flight with a suitcase at midnight, not a chase across state lines, just a legal relocation, a new address, a new job, a quiet shift that makes him harder to watch, harder to pressure, harder to surprise. The law allows it. Innocent people move all the time. Guilty people move too. The difference is invisible unless evidence makes it visible. And evidence, despite everything, refuses to become the clean blade everyone needs. The final meeting of the year happens in a small room with stale coffee and a board full of photos that have become familiar in the worst way. The woman's smile on the missing poster, the stairwell wall torn open, the strip of fabric under sterile light, the duffel bag laid out on wet asphalt, the suspect's face from a driver's license photo, the witness's handwritten statement, the outage record, the text fragment. It's done. The detective speaks softly, not to inspire, not to dramatize, but because he's speaking into a silence that feels thick as cement. He says they have moved this case farther than anyone thought possible. He says they have made it real again. He says they have given the family something they didn't have, confirmation that the city's silence had a location, a stairwell, a wall, and night. And then he says the part that tastes like metal in the mouth, they still do not have her. No remains. No definitive cause. No place to bury. No single, unassailable chain that forces a verdict in court. The prosecutor will keep working. The detectives will keep watching. The file will stay open. But the truth, the whole truth, the one that ends with a period instead of an ellipsis, still sits just out of reach, not because the case isn't strong, but because time is a collaborator with anyone who knows how to wait. That night, long after the precinct quiets, the lead detective walks past the evidence lockers and hears the building settle, pipes clicking, old radiators sighing, sounds that in the dark can almost mimic footsteps. He stops at the shelf where the fabric strip rests in a sealed bag, labeled with date and case number, and he stares at it the way you stare at a locked door you can't open, knowing the answer is behind it and knowing the key might not exist anymore. Outside, New York keeps moving, taxis cutting through wet streets, the river rolling under bridges with its indifferent pull, and somewhere a mother lies awake again at 3 a.m., listening for a phone call that might finally tell her where her daughter went after the lights in a stairwell blinked out. The phone does ring, but not with closure, not with a confession that names a place and an act and an ending. It's another tip. Another voice, older, hesitant, asking if the police are still looking into that 2001 cold case, saying they saw something back then, or they heard something, or they kept quiet because everyone keeps quiet until quiet becomes unbearable. The detective takes the call, pen poised, heart steady because he has learned not to let hope make him careless, and as the voice begins to speak, the city outside continues to hum like nothing is happening, as if it has never carried a missing life in its veins. As if the stairwell never went dark, as if a wall never closed over a piece of cloth that held a woman's DNA like a last whisper. And that is the final cruelty and the final truth of this story. The case is reopened. The past is awake. The community is shaken, But the answer, the full, clean answer, still lives somewhere in the space between what people remember, what people admit, and what the city has already swallowed, leaving behind a cold case that refuses to die. Not because it is unsolvable, but because the truth is still being held by someone, somewhere in the darkness, and the darkness has been patient for a very long time.